Welcome to Through a Glass Darkly Radio. You're listening to us on United Public Radio. And the intro song was Mark of the Doomslayer by Karl Casey at White Bat Audio. I hope you enjoyed your holidays, had a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, wonderful Festivus for the rest of us, etc. I have a care of the Future Forecasting Group. I have a new webcam that's like a 4K, so I'm still trying to figure it out. Webcam with a tripod and a key light and all that good stuff. So hopefully it works well. We'll see. It might be like I'm not looking at the camera half the time in this podcast, but it's going to be a lot better resolution. So, all right, a few things to discuss before we get started, and then obviously I can go through some of the comments. But if you are a long-term subscriber and you think you're subscribed, please double check. YouTube, as a nice Christmas present, I think on the 26th, I was actually negative on subscribers. They just wiped out a bunch of subscribers. So, maybe a few people decided to spike my Christmas and unsubscribe, or maybe YouTube decided to do that. I'm more inclined to believe it's YouTube. So I know this happens to a lot of you often, so just please double check. And if you think you're subscribed, it's not guaranteed. So just please double check. Second thing is, if you've enjoyed this podcast for many a time, I humbly ask for your subscription. I'd be honored to do me, or I'd be honored to have the honor. And then lastly, as I always say, because I'm all about truth, I came up with the topic, but AI kind of wrote the script. So everything else that I do on this channel is kind of is organic. This is the only thing that's not organic, and it's because I work all the time. I even worked on Christmas. But I did finish 3/4 of the episodes that I need for January, and I recorded 2 more today. So 6 are already processed, uploaded, and done. Another 2, I just finished editing the audio for one of them today. But anyway, I have all the material I need to finish January before January. And then at the audience's request, I reached out to 3 Bigfoot researchers. Only one's responded, and that is Chris Kramer, who I actually had the pleasure of talking to on the telephone. A great person. He's actually from the same area of the country that I am, so we got along fast friends pretty quickly. So I'm going to interview him on the day of New Year's Eve, not at night, but in the morning. So I'll have that, and then I have another interview scheduled with Rich Geldrich. So I should be good into like the first third of February by the time this period is over. So I am definitely using my time off from work to get as much done as humanly possible. So the first part of last week though was not well used because my audio, it took me 3 days to edit the audio on 6 episodes because the audio was failing over and over and over and over again. It was extremely frustrating. And then it took me like a day to edit the video portion of all 6 episodes. And then it took me another day to just upload them, create all the thumbnails, and like deal with all the YouTube administrivia. So, I'm just trying to get my basic things down, and then hopefully I can, get everything else, start getting ahead on a bunch of other initiatives that I have for next year, including publishing my first novel, which was done a long time ago, but I just need to read through it and just make sure that I go through grammar and stuff like that. And then I got to design the cover, and hopefully I will be able to finish that over this break. So anyway, I only have a week left. So anyway, with that, let's go through some comments, and then I'll get started on the on the topic. So Sally Forth Alone. Yeah, it's new to me too. I'm going to learn with you basically. So Fast Mama Gemma saying I was working on bird heating system today. Interesting. Yeah, I don't have Duncan right now, but I had it like I gotta stop doing the Duncan thing. So Philip Blair's writing Happy New Year's, Merry third day of Christmas, and Yuletide greetings to all. Okay, if it's from Tibet, it's got to be true, right? By the way, I just read in the New York Times that the CIA in like the 50s left a nuclear device in the Himalayas. I mean, I don't know if I don't think it's an atomic nuclear device. It was just radiologically powered. So William Author is saying Happy Yuletide. Kurt is saying great to see you, Sean. Hope you had a great holiday and to a Happy New Year. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Pavlos is saying, looking good, brother. The lighting looks good, no shadows. You have no idea how hard it was to do that. Like, this thing is because I have and hopefully you can hear me because I have a microphone there. I have this cat. Ooh, well, that's just because I have a green screen. That's why my hands are all weird. I have the webcam there and then the lights up there. So I had to manage all the shadows and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, okay, just going through. You got powerful light in your face. Yes. Yes. William Author saying still meditating. Thank you, Philip Blair. Philip Blair is still subscribed. Okay. So Fast Mama Gemma saying I got no new subscribers for a long time. Yeah, it's really so Tim Beck is saying, hey, Art, no thing it's true, everything is permitted. Yeah, that's from I can help Bigfoot researcher to develop AI Bigfoot. Okay. William Author says infinite consciousness allows for infinite possibilities, Tim. So Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism is argued to be influenced by Christianity. Buddhism in Tibet originally came from the Nalanda tradition of India. Infinite games art. Mongolians and Han have been influential in Tibet too, Philip Blair says. William Author said the CIA has to be one of the most evil groups. So Fastmo Jama said Giorgiani said in Danny Jones that the Japan nukes had German enriched uranium. Yeah, I think that's actually real. Pablo said glad you didn't get washed away with all this rain. Well, yeah, I know it's been absolutely nuts. And hey, Solite US Expat, good to see you, my friend. All right, let's get started. So I don't start losing people. Like I came here for the Tibetan Book of the Bed, not for this noise. All right, it's going to be weird that I'm not necessarily looking directly at the camera. Hey, Sun Dragon, good to see you. All right, let's get started. All right, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. History, context, and influence. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, known in Tibetan as Bardo Thirdo, meaning liberation through hearing in the intermediate state. What a pretentious name. It's one of the most famous works of Tibetan Buddhism and a subject of fascination for scholars, spiritual practitioners, and occult enthusiasts alike. It is essentially a funerary guide intended to be read aloud to those who have died or are approaching death, with the purpose of guiding the consciousness through the post-mortem journey and towards a favorable rebirth or even liberation from the cycle of rebirth altogether. First translated into English in 1927 by W.Y. Evans Wentz, who titled it The Tibetan Book of the Dead, in conscious analogy to the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. The text has since become the best-known example of Tibetan religious literature in the West. Its enduring popularity stems from its profound teachings on life, death, and the afterlife, which combine esoteric Buddhist philosophy with practical ritual instructions. This podcast provides a comprehensive exploration of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, examining its historical origins and authorship, its philosophical and spiritual foundations within Tibetan Buddhism, an overview of its structure and contents, especially the Bardo Thirdal and its stages, its role in Tibetan funerary practices and cultural life, comparisons with the Egyptian Book of the Dead and other similar texts, and its influence on Western esotericism, psychology, and contemporary spiritual movements. So let's start with the historical background and authorship of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. According to Tibetan tradition, the text known as Bardo Thirdal is a terma, or treasure text, hidden in Tibet until the proper time for its revelation. It is attributed mythically to the 8th century Buddhist master Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, who is said to have composed its teachings and concealed them to benefit future generations. The actual writing down of the text is credited to Padmasambhava's primary disciple, the female adept Yeshe Sogyal, who recorded the master's oral teachings and hid the manuscript in the Gampo hills of central Tibet. Centuries later, in the 14th century, this hidden teaching was discovered by a Terkyun treasure finder named Karma Lingpa, who lived from 1326 to 1386. Karma Lingpa retrieved the text as part of a larger cycle of revelations known as the profound Dharma of self-liberation through the intention of the peaceful and wrathful ones, of which the Bardo Thirdal forms one portion. After its discovery, the text began to be transmitted within the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the oldest of Tibet's Buddhist lineages and used in ritual contexts. So, authorship and dating. While the Tibetan tradition ascribes authorship to Padmasambhava in the 8th century, modern scholarship generally regards the Bardo Thirdal as having been composed or compiled around the time of its discovery in the 14th century. In other words, the historical authorship is likely Karma Lingpa himself or the Nyingma school or scholars of his era, who could have incorporated earlier oral teachings and liturgical practices into the written text. This is not unusual in Tibetan literature. Many terma texts blend older Buddhist concepts with new elaborations, all attributed to legendary figures for reverence. The fact that Padmasambhava is credited reflects his iconic status as the propagator of Tantric Buddhism in Tibet. By linking the work to him, the text grants authority and spiritual cachet. It should be noted that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is actually a Western nickname. The Tibetan title Bardo Thirdal translates to liberation through hearing in the intermediate state, which more accurately describes its function. The evocative English title was coined by Evans Wentz in 1927 specifically to draw a parallel with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, as he believed both to be the guidebooks for the afterlife journey. Despite some misleading implications of that title, the Tibetan text is not a book placed with the corpse, but instructions read aloud. It has nevertheless captured the imagination of Western readers and remains in common use. The Bardo Thirdal first came to Western attention in the early 20th century. The pivotal moment was the 1927 English translation by Walter Y. Evans Wentz, titled The Tibetan Book of the Dead. Evans Wentz, a scholar of comparative religion with theosophical leanings, worked not from the original Tibetan directly, but via an English rendering provided by the Lama Kazi Dawa Samdup. In his edition, Evans Wentz added extensive commentary that interpreted the Tibetan text through a theosophical and Vedantic lens, sometimes distorting or obscuring its authentic Buddhist meaning. For example, he introduced Hindu terminology and ideas of astral bodies that are not present in the Tibetan original. Despite these issues, the Evans Wentz edition was highly influential. It went through several revisions and included a psychological commentary by Karl Jung in a later edition, further raising its profile in the West. Subsequent decades produced more accurate translations, noted by Francesca Fremantle and Chogyam Trungpa in 1975, and a complete scholarly translation by Guillermo Dorja in 2005, which better reflected the text's Buddhist context. Through these translations, the Bardo Thundal became one of the first Tibetan Buddhist texts widely read outside Asia, securing its status as a bridge between Eastern and Western perspectives on death and the afterlife. Philosophical and spiritual foundations in Tibetan Buddhism. To appreciate the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one must understand the Buddhist philosophical worldview in which it arose. The text is rooted in the teachings of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, incorporating elements of Mahayana philosophy and unique Tibetan insights. Several key concepts from the foundation for its approach to death and rebirth: samsara, karma, and liberation. Buddhism teaches that unenlightened beings are caught in samsara, a cyclic existence of death and rebirth propelled by karma, the accumulated effects of one's actions. Suffering, or dukkha, persists so long as one remains attached to worldly desires and ignorant of the true nature of reality. The ultimate goal is to attain enlightenment, bodhi, and achieve liberation, moksha or nirvana, escaping the cycle of rebirth. The Bardo Thirdal squarely operates within this soteriological framework. Its entire purpose is to help the deceased either reach enlightenment or at least a higher rebirth by providing timely guidance when the pull of past karma is strongest. The text assumes that the deceased person's consciousness, if left unguided, will follow its habitual karmic tendencies into a new existence, possibly a negative one if their past actions were unvirtuous. Thus, the Bardo Thirdal is a last opportunity to recognize the nature of reality and be freed from samsara, or barring that, to steer the consciousness toward a favorable rebirth. Then there's Bardo, an intermediate state, a distinctive contribution of Tibetan Buddhism, especially Nyingma Vajrayana, is the elaborate doctrine of bardos, or intermediate states. While the concept of an interval between death and rebirth appears in early Buddhist thought, it was in Tibet that this idea was greatly expanded and systematized. The Bardo Thirdal delineates several bardos, most crucially the intermediate states after death. According to Tibetan belief, the interval between one's life and the next lasts up to 49 days, a time during which the consciousness of the deceased experiences various visions and phenomena before finally taking rebirth. This period is subdivided into three main bardos in the text. The first is the Chikai Bardo, or moment of death, when the mind encounters the clear light. The second is the Chunyid Bardo, or state of visions, where peaceful and wrathful deities appear. The third is the Sidpa Bardo, or pre-birth, seeking of rebirth, where judgment and karmic propensities propel one into a new life. Additionally, Tibetan readings often list three other bardos pertaining to life. the bardos of waking life, dreaming, and meditation. In essence, every transitional phase is considered a bardo, a chance for realization, but the post-death bardos are particularly potent because the consciousness is no longer tethered to a physical body and thus more pliable, yet also more prone to confusion. The bardo of Thudal's guidance is predicated on the belief that by hearing and recalling the teachings during these transitions, the dead can navigate them more skillfully. Then there's mind's nature and illusory visions. At the heart of the Bardo Thudal, spiritual teaching is a refined understanding of mind and reality, drawn from Mahayana and Vajrayana philosophy. Specifically, the text aligns with Dzogchen and Madhyamaka views that the ultimate nature of mind is luminous clarity and emptiness. The moment of death is believed to reveal the intrinsic clear light, a radiant emptiness that is mind's true nature and the ground of all experience. If the dying person can recognize this clear light as identical with their own deepest awareness, often equated with Rigpa in Dzogchen terms, they can achieve instantaneous liberation. However, for most beings, this recognition fails, and they proceed into the intermediate visionary stages. The Bardo Thudal emphasizes that the diverse apparitions encountered in the Bardo, from beatific Buddhas to terrifying demons, are projections of one's own mind. They have no independent reality. Rather, they reflect the deceased's mental imprints, emotions, and habitual tendencies. This teaching is deeply grounded in the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness, or shunyata, which holds that phenomena lack inherent existence and appear due to causes and conditions, including the mind's conditioning. Therefore, the key instruction repeated throughout the Bardo Thudal is to recognize these visions as illusory manifestations of mind and to remain non-attached and fearless in their presence. By doing so, one can dissipate the power of these visions, attain liberation, these visions, which otherwise might provoke fear or craving, leading to unwise choices, and thereby attain liberation or a better rebirth. Thus reflects a tantric principle. The arising of even wrathful, frightening images can be an opportunity to realize the mind's nature, since all forms, peaceful or wrathful, are expressions of the enlightened mind when seen correctly. In Tibetan art and practice, this is mirrored by meditational deities, Yidam, who have peaceful or wrathful aspects but are understood to be fundamentally enlightened manifestations. The Bardo Thudal, in a sense, ritualizes and dramatizes this inner psychodrama on the stage of the after-death experience. Another foundation of the text is the Mahayana Buddhist ethos of compassion and skillful means. The very existence of a guidebook for the dead implies the compassionate intent of helping sentient beings at a critical and vulnerable juncture. In Tibetan culture, it is believed that the consciousness of the deceased can still hear and benefit from prayers and guidance for some time after clinical death. This is tied to the idea that hearing, Thudal, liberation by healing, the teachings, even if one cannot intellectually process them, can plant seeds in the consciousness or trigger recognition on a subliminal level. The Bardo Thudal thus serves as a upaya, skillful means, a clever method to communicate Dharma to someone who can no longer sit in meditation or study sutras, but who can be reached through ritual incantation. It also reflects the Tibetan emphasis on Lama, or Guru, intervention, and the power of mantras and prayers at the time of death. The text often includes specific liturgical verses to recite, admonitions addressed directly to the deceased by name, and detailed visualizations to invoke if one has the capacity. All these are meant to jolt the consciousness into awareness, or at least coax it along a positive path. The philosophical rationale is that even a person who failed to attain enlightenment in life might, through the compassionate efforts of others and the sudden clarity of the bardo, get a second chance after death. This is congruent with broader Tibetan Buddhist practices, such as Phowa, or transference of consciousness at death, and the reliance on enlightened beings like Amitabha in Pure Land practices to guide one after death. It's a fusion of personal responsibility, recognizing mind's nature, and altruistic aid, or ritual support by the living and enlightened Buddhas, embodying the Mahayana ideal that we all assist each other toward liberation. In summary, the Tibetan Book of the Dead stands on a rich tapestry of Buddhist thought. The impermanence of life, the continuity of consciousness after death, or the continuity of consciousness through rebirth, the potency of karma, the emptiness of phenomena, and the transformative potential of spiritual insight at the moment of death. It is both philosophically profound, pointing to non-dual awareness and the illusory nature of appearances, and pragmatically grounded, offering step-by-step guidance grounded in ritual and meditation practice. This combination of metaphysics and methodology is characteristic of Tibetan Buddhism, especially in its Vajrayana aspect, which seeks to use every experience, including death, as an opportunity for awakening. The structure and contents of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The Bardo Thirdal is not a single linear narrative, but rather a collection of texts within the peaceful and wrathful one's cycle, arranged as practical guides for different stages of the post-death experience. It can be seen as a manual divided into sections corresponding to the phases a consciousness undergoes from the moment of death up to the threshold of the next rebirth. The structure is often summarized in terms of the three bardos after death and the specific teachings or liturgies related to each. Here we outline the major components and content. First, there's the preliminary instructions before death. The text begins with advice on recognizing the signs of impending death and performing certain ritual practices in the dying process. For example, there are instructions for friends or lamas to start reciting guidance in the ear of a person who is dying, ideally before the moment of death and immediately after, to ensure the consciousness hears the instructions from the very start of its journey. This section often includes prayers to various Buddhas or protective deities, and guidance to the dying person to mentally let go of attachments and focus on virtuous thoughts. In some Tibetan traditions, this is when Phowa is performed, which is a meditation to eject the consciousness and direct it toward a Buddha field, though Phowa instructions are usually separate texts. Also included are chapters on signs of death, which help a practitioner or family recognize that death is near and prepare spiritually. The second component is the moment of death, the Chikai Bardo. The first and most critical stage, described in the Chikai Bardo, the Bardo of the moment of death. At the very point of death, according to the text, the person's consciousness experiences the primordial, clear light of reality. This is described as a dazzling radiance, an unmanifested brilliance often equated with the nature of mind or nirvanic peace. The Bardo Thirdal instructs the practitioner or the lama reading to them to recognize this clear light as one's own true nature and to merge with it. It states that if the dying person can maintain awareness for even a short moment during this phase, they can attain instant liberation, essentially achieving enlightenment at the moment of death. However, it acknowledges that most fail to recognize the clear light due to the obscurations of ignorance and the shock of the death experience. and thus lose consciousness or panic, which then causes them to miss this opportunity and move on to the next bardo. The text provides specific verses to be recited at this time, gently reminding the deceased, "O noble one, now you are experiencing the clear light of pure reality. Recognize it. This is the natural mind, luminous and empty." Such admonitions are often repeated to encourage recognition. The duration of the clear light experience in the text is traditionally said to last as long as it takes for the subtle consciousness to disengage. Some texts say it's a brief flash. Others allow that an experienced meditator's consciousness might remain in the clear light state for up to 3 days after clinical death. Indeed, Tibetan tradition speaks of realized masters remaining in a state of tukdam, post-mortem meditative absorption, during which their body shows no signs of decay for days, a sign they are abiding in the clear light. Out of respect, the bodies are left undisturbed until this meditation ends, which is one reason there is a custom of not touching or moving a corpse for a certain period after death. For ordinary individuals, the instruction is concise. Try to recognize the light. If not, then at least do not fear it. The clear light is considered the first opportunity for liberation in the Bardo sequence. Number 3, the Bardo of Dharmata. Chunyid Bardo, visions of peaceful and wrathful deities. Failing liberation at the moment of death, the consciousness transitions into what the text calls the Chunyid Bardo, or the Bardo of experiencing reality, or Dharmata, often simply called the visionary Bardo. Over the course of what is traditionally up to 14 days, the deceased will experience a progression of visionary encounters with various deities and archetypal figures. The Bardo Thirdal describes these in a very specific sequence. For days 1 through 7, they encounter the peaceful deities. On the first day in the Bardo after the clear light, the deceased sees a soft white light along with the manifestation of Vairocana, the central Buddha of the Dharmadhatu, accompanied by attendant Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. On the second day, they encounter a red light, an Amitabha Buddha, and so on. In total, there are 5 Buddha families, the Tathagatas, that appear one by one on successive days, each residing in a particular cardinal direction, emanating a brilliant colored light, white, blue, yellow, red, green, representing their wisdom. Alongside each pure light, however, the Bardo Thirdal says there also appears a dimmer, seductive light corresponding to one of the 6 realms of samsara. For example, alongside Buddha Vairocana's light appears a dull gray light of the animal realm. Alongside Buddha Amitabha's light appears a soft red of the Preta, hungry ghost realm, etc. The text warns the deceased not to be attracted to these gentler lights of samsaric rebirth, but instead to move toward the bright wisdom lights of the Buddhas. The peaceful deities appear in majestic, benevolent forms, often seated on lotus thrones, radiating soothing energy. The crucial instruction is to recognize them as manifestations of one's own mind and the clear light. The deceased is urged, do not be afraid of these brilliant lights. They are your own compassionate gurus and yidams. Trust them, merge with them. If the consciousness can recognize and merge, it will attain liberation, the second opportunity. Each day's readings include prayers of supplication to the deity of that day, reminding the soul not to yield to fear or fascination for lesser lights. From days 8 to 14, these are the days of the wrathful deities. After the cycle of peaceful visions, the tone shifts dramatically. From around the 8th day onward, the consciousness starts to encounter terrifying apparitions, the wrathful deities. Interestingly, the text explains that these wrathful forms are not different entities from the peaceful Buddhas previously seen. They are the same enlightened beings in wrathful aspect. In Tibetan iconography, these are the Herukas, or wrathful protectors, often depicted with fearsome attributes: multiple heads, many arms holding weapons, wearing garlands of skulls, breathing fire, drinking blood from skull caps, etc. For example, peaceful Avalokiteshvara, or Chenrezig, may appear in a wrathful form as Hayagriva, or peaceful Manjushri may appear as fierce Yamantaka. The Bardo Thirdal describes 58 wrathful entities, or deities in total, who appear in a chaotic, tumultuous procession over a series of nights. The cosmos seems to shatter with stormy sounds, and demonic figures fill the vision. To an unprepared mind, this can be overwhelmingly frightening. Here again, the text's counsel is unwavering. Recognition is key. The wrathful deities, too, are projections of one's own anger and fear, manifestations of the mind's energy. If the deceased understands this, that these terrifying forms are in truth one's own enlightened essence displaying in wrathful form to shock one into recognition, then even the horror becomes a source of liberation. The text often encourages a blend of fearlessness and devotion at this juncture. For example, one passage says, "Fear not the wrathful ones. They are your own mind's empty forms. They are like illusions. Remember the Dharma's teachings. Call upon the compassionate Padmasambhava, and you shall be liberated." By design, these wrathful visions are a kind of final test of the mind's stability. If one panics and fails to recognize them, one's own terror can cause the consciousness to black out or flee, missing the chance of liberation. The third opportunity passes. On the other hand, embracing the wrathful deities as none other than wisdom in disguise can lead to a profound realization of emptiness and thus liberation. Fourth, the judgment and pre-rebirth bardo, the Sidpa bardo. After the cycle of visionary experiences, the consciousness enters the Sidpa bardo, which is the intermediate state of rebirth, of becoming. By this stage, if liberation has not been attained through recognition of the previous visions, the momentum of bardo, of karma, begins to assert itself strongly, pulling the being toward a specific rebirth. The Bardo Thirdal's tone shifts from transcendental visions to almost pragmatic advice on choosing a good rebirth and avoiding bad ones. This section contains vivid imagery of a judgment scene. The deceased appears before King Yama, the Lord of Death, which is drawn from Buddhist folklore, who holds up the mirror of karma, in which all of one's deeds are reflected. In some versions, Yama's henchmen weigh white pebbles, good deeds, against black pebbles, bad deeds, on a scale. This is strikingly anomalous to the weighing of the heart in Egyptian lore, which we'll discuss later. Though in the Tibetan context, it is a one-time pass-fail into paradise. Or it is not a one-time pass-fail into paradise, but rather a determinant of one's next incarnation. The Bardo Thirdal stresses that this judgment is not administered by an external God in truth. It is one's own karma manifesting. In fact, it says that Yama is a projection of your own guilt and fear. If one realizes this, the scene loses its power to terrify. Nonetheless, for most, this karmic accounting feels very real, and the consciousness, unable to remain in the Bardo indefinitely, is now driven to find a new birth. The text then gives a tutorial on the 6 realms of rebirth, the possible destinies a being can take. These are: 1, the guide realm, a heavenly but impermanent realm of pleasure. 2, the demigod Ashura realm, a realm of power and jealousy. 3, the human realm, considered the most fortunate rebirth for spiritual practice, a mixture of pleasure and pain, offering the best balance for seeking enlightenment. Then there's 4th, the animal realm, marked by ignorance and servitude. 5, the hungry ghost or Preda realm, characterized by insatiable craving and dissatisfaction. And 6, the hell realm, spheres of intense suffering and aggression. The Bardo Thirdal provides descriptions of signs that indicate which realm one is gravitating towards. For example, a vision of voluptuous orchards might lure one into the god realm, or seeing families feasting could indicate the hungry ghost realm. Importantly, it counsels the deceased to avoid the lower realms at all costs, and if liberation is not possible, to aim for rebirth in a higher realm, ideally back in the human realm or even in a pure land of a Buddha. Specific techniques are given, such as close the womb's door to undesirable births. This refers to the teachings that as the consciousness nears rebirth, it will be drawn to scenes of future parents copulating. If those parents belong to a lower realm, one should resist the attraction and thus close the door to that womb. Conversely, if a positive rebirth is found, one should mentally pray to be born to spiritually minded parents or in a place where one can encounter the Dharma. The text even gives a prayer for choosing the womb, essentially a last-minute aspiration for a conducive rebirth. If the consciousness still cannot find a suitable birth, it will lose consciousness every 7 days and then reawaken, essentially undergoing a mini death and mini rebirth in the Bardo up to 7 times until the 49 days maximum is reached. By the end of that period, a rebirth becomes inevitable according to one's karma. The Bardo Thirdal's final instructions are on how to recognize and enter a good womb, or how to perform a last transfer of consciousness to a pure realm, if one has the meditative ability to do so. The text often concludes with fervent prayers to Buddhas and guardians to protect the departed being from the torturous path and lead them to liberation or a fortunate rebirth. In terms of literary composition, the Bardo Thirdal is a mix of instructional prose and liturgical verse. Sections often begin with direct address. O nobly born, listen without distraction, creating an eerie immediacy, as if the book is speaking directly to the departed soul. This stylistic choice underscores that the text is meant to be read aloud by a lama or spiritual friend to the dead, dying as a script. The verses sometimes take the form of prayerful supplications to the deities of the day or expressions of the refuge in the 3 jewels of Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and the Guru. In places, the tone shifts to metaphysical exposition, describing, for instance, how the elements of the body dissolve in stages at death, earth into water, water into fire, etc., and how corresponding sensory experiences fade. Knowledge drawn from Vajrayana, tantric physiology, and also found in other texts. The dissolution process culminates in a manifestation of the clear light, as previously mentioned. By integrating these details, the text not only guides but also educates, reminding any listeners, including those attending the dying person, of core teachings on impermanence and the mind. It's also important to note that the Bardo Thirdal, as commonly known, is part of a larger compendium. Within the revealed cycle, there are chapters dealing with specific rituals, like cremation ceremonies or breathing instructions, and extensions that form a kind of death liturgy corpus. The famous English translations, however, often focus on the central guide through the Bardos portion as described above, since that is of universal interest. Robert Thurman, for example, translated it under the title, The Great Book of Natural Liberation Through Understanding in the Between. And Guillermo Dorje's translation includes it as a chapter within the whole self-liberation through peaceful and wrathful ones cycle. In summary, the content of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is systematically laid out to mirror the natural unfolding of the after-death process. From the moment of death, offering a chance at enlightenment by recognizing the clear light through intermediate visions, offering repeated chances to recognize the nature of mind through peaceful and wrathful forms, to the preparation for rebirth, offering guidance to influence the next life favorably. Each stage comes with its own set of instructions and spiritual exercises. This structure brilliantly encapsulates a complete Buddhist teaching. It recapitulates the path to enlightenment, which is clear light recognition, recognizing Buddha nature in all forms, overcoming one's fears and attachments, and finally, consciously choosing a virtuous rebirth if needed. Little wonder that Tibetan lamas often say the Bardo Thirdal is as much a guide for the living as it is for the dead. It teaches us how to deal with change and transition right now by using death as the ultimate example. So now let's look at the role of the Tibetan Book of the Dead in funerary practice and its cultural significance. In Tibetan culture, the Bardo Thirdal is not just a theoretical text. It is a practical tool integral to death rituals and the communal response to death. Its usage in funerary practices reflects Tibetan beliefs about consciousness and rebirth, and it also illuminates broader cultural values regarding compassion, impermanence, and the continuity between life and death. The primary role of the Tibetan Book of the Dead in funerary context is its recitation as a guidance for the soul of the deceased. After a person has died, or even in the moments just before death, if possible, a lama or experienced practitioner will perform reading sessions of the Bardo Thirdal near the corpse or in the vicinity of the deceased's body. This is often done daily or at regular intervals for up to 49 days, corresponding to the belief in a 49-day maximum Bardo period before rebirth. The text is recited aloud in a clear voice, sometimes calling out the dead person's name at critical junctures to hold their attention. O son, daughter of family X, listen. It is believed that even though the person is dead, their consciousness, or Shipa, a kind of mental body in the Bardo, can still hear and benefit from these instructions. The practice is essentially a form of vigil. Just as some cultures pray for the departed for days, like a wake or a novena, Tibetans actively guide the dead each day, hoping to influence their journey. Families will invite lamas or monks for this purpose, and it's seen as an act of great merit and compassion to sponsor such rituals for a loved one. The Bardo Thirdal itself says, "Do not let your thoughts wander, concentrate on my words," as if addressing the disembodied spirit, urging it not to drift or succumb to illusions. The recitation includes the sections described earlier, instructions at the moment of death, which would be read immediately if the Lama is present at the deathbed. Then the descriptions of each day's visions and how to handle them. By repeatedly exposing the consciousness to these reminders, Tibetans believe the soul has a better chance to recognize what's happening and react in a spiritually constructive way. The Bardo Thirdal readings are part of a larger complex of Tibetan funerary rites. For example, in the first few days after death, lamas may perform the Powa, transference of consciousness ritual, attempting to eject the soul from the body through the crown chakra and send it directly to a pure land or higher realm. Once the body is prepared for disposal, be it cremation, sky burial, or internment, additional prayers like the Fowa's mantra or the prayer of deliverance might be recited. During these times, passages from the Bardo Thirdal might be interspersed or combined with other texts like the aspiration prayer for rebirth in Dawakchen, which is Amitabha's Pure Land. The Bardo Thirdal itself includes chapters on ritual practices such as burning effigies or saying certain mantra symbols to close the doors to unfortunate realms. For instance, there are instructions to visualize specific Buddhas at cardinal points around the corpse, or to perform offerings that please wrathful deities so they won't scare the soul excessively. Monks may create intricate sand mandalas, or tormas, ritual cakes, representing the peaceful and wrathful deities to sanctify the space. In some regions of Tibet, after the 49 days, a concluding ceremony is held to mark the end of the Bardo period, where the Bardo Thirdal's final verses are chanted and the deceased's name is inscribed on prayer flags or stupas. Not all Tibetan lineages emphasize the Bardo Thirdal equally. It is particularly a specialty of the Nyingma school, which treasures the Terma literature of Padmasa Bhava. Other schools, like Gelug or Kagyu, also have Bardo teachings, but may rely more on different texts, like Lamrim or Segyu prayers. However, the Bardo Thirdal has become widely known across Tibetan society, even in its slightly adapted forms. The prominence of the Tibetan Book of the Dead in funerary customs reflects a cultural comfort with and preparation for death that is characteristic of Tibet. Tibetans traditionally view death as a natural transition, one that can be prepared for and navigated through rather than a taboo or merely a tragedy. From a young age, devout Tibetans are taught to recite the impermanence verses and contemplate the inevitability of death as a means to motivate spiritual practices. The Bardo Thirdal takes the philosophical acceptance and operationalizes it. It turns death into a rite of passage with its own roadmap. Families often set aside mourning in the conventional sense to focus on helping the deceased along their journey. They might hire monks to continuously chant or read texts for weeks. In some cases, they will place items of personal significance or spiritual power, such as blessed relic pills or sacred syllables written on paper, on the body or in the coffin, to symbolically equip the person for their Bardo travels. The reading of the Bardo Thirdal is sometimes done at the bedside repeatedly, which also has a calming effect on the living, giving them a sense of agency that they are doing something beneficial for the departed instead of just grieving passively. This practice also underscores the communal aspect. Death in Tibet is not purely a private affair, but a moment where the monastic and lay community engages together. Lamas coming to perform Bardo Thirdal readings and other rites strengthen community bonds, and often the teachings in the text are as much for the living listeners as for the deceased. It reminds everyone present of the Buddhist teachings on the afterlife, encouraging them to live ethically so as to have a better Bardo experience themselves one day. In effect, Tibetan funerary practice using the Book of the Dead doubles as a didactic theater. While ostensibly guiding the dead, it is simultaneously educating the living about what truly matters at life's end, one's mental and moral state. Beyond the ritual usage, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has seeped into Tibetan art, literature, and folklore. The vivid imagery of peaceful and wrathful deities has inspired countless thangkas, or sacred paintings, and temple murals. The Zitro, the peaceful, wrathful mandala, which depicts the entire assembly of 100 deities mentioned in the text, 42 peaceful, 58 wrathful, is a popular motif. Monks and practitioners might meditate on this mandala in life, visualizing themselves confronting these figures as a rehearsal for the moment of death. This shows how the Bardo Thirdal is not just read at death, it's studied and contemplated by the devout during life as well. Texts such as the Bardo Guidebook by Karma Lingpa, another part of the same cycle, are essentially commentaries on how to use the Book of the Dead's teachings in daily practice. Some meditation lineages incorporate Bardo visualizations and advanced retreats, and many High Lamas have written their own manuals on guiding consciousness through death. So, for instance, there's the first Panchen Lama's Peaceful and Wrathful Deity Practice, or more modern works like the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sagyal Rinpoche, which draws heavily on Bardo Thirdal material. Furthermore, the Bardo Thirdal has influenced Tibetan cultural attitudes in the sense of a relatively fearless outlook on dying. While no one is eager to die, Tibetans historically have been described by observers as approaching death with a certain equanimity, often attributing it to their belief that they have clear instructions and that death is not an end, merely a transition. There's even a genre of Tibetan literature known as Dilak stories about people who seemingly die, experience the Bardos, and return to life, recounting what they saw, which usually aligns closely with the Book of the Dead's depictions. These are like near-death experience tales and are popular among lay people, reinforcing the reality of the teachings. One famous 20th century Dilak, Dawa Drolma, described being accompanied by a deity through various hells and bardos, witnessing Yama's court, and then being sent back to warn humans to practice virtue. Her account reads like a validation of the Bardo Thodol scenarios and is often cited in Tibetan circles as proof of these teachings. In daily cultural life, phrases from the Bardo Thirdal have entered common parlance. For instance, a dying person might be reminded, "Don't cling to this life. Remember the teachings in the between." Families might comfort themselves by saying, "We are helping him recognize the lights." It's noticeable that in Tibet, the Book of the Dead is not usually printed as a book for casual reading, the way it has in the West. Traditionally, it was kept as part of monastic liturgical collections. However, almost every Tibetan knows of it, much as many in Christian cultures know of prayers like the Last Rites or Psalm 23, even if they are not theologians. It's embedded in the fabric of how death is understood. In modern times, especially after 1959, when many Tibetans went into exile, the Bardo Thirdal also became a point of cultural identity. Teaching these death rites to the younger generation in diaspora has been a way to preserve Tibetan spiritual heritage. The Dalai Lama and other leaders have often stressed the importance of these practices. The Dalai Lama even wrote a foreword praising the text as a profound guide, not only for afterlife, but for living a meaningful life with awareness of death. In summary, the Tibetan Book of the Dead plays a multifaceted role in Tibetan funerary practice. It is a literal guidebook for the dead, a ritual script for lamas, a source of comfort and purpose for the bereaved, and a cultural repository of Tibet's most deeply held beliefs about life, death, and enlightenment. Its presence at virtually every deathbed, at least ideally, in traditional Tibetan society underscores its foundational place in the cultural psyche. Death is often called the final exam of a practitioner. The Bardo Thirdal is the cheat sheet, study guide, and compassionate tutor rolled into one, ensuring that no soul goes unassisted on that lonely journey. Now let's talk about comparative perspectives. The Tibetan and Egyptian Books of the Dead. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is frequently compared to the Egyptian Book of the Dead due to the superficial similarity of their names and their shared focus on guiding the deceased through the afterlife. While they indeed serve analogous functions in their respective cultures, acting as manuals or maps for the post-mortem journey, their cosmologies, symbolisms, and ultimate religious goals differ significantly. Comparing these two illuminates both universal human concerns about death and culturally specific ways of addressing those concerns. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, more accurately titled The Book of Coming Forth by Day, is an ancient funerary text from Egypt's New Kingdom period, which is circa 1550 BC, though it draws on older pyramid texts and coffin texts. It is not a single book, but rather a compendium of spells, prayers, and illustrations, written on papyrus scrolls and buried with the dead. Each copy of the Book of the Dead was often customized for the individual, usually wealthy nobility, as these scrolls were expensive, with the deceased's name inserted and only the spells deemed necessary for that person. In contrast, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a text intended for oral performance by the living, rather than a physical object interned with the corpse. The Egyptian text was literally entombed with mummies to be read by the soul itself in the afterlife, whereas the Tibetan text is recited in the presence of the corpse or at memorial services by lamas. This points to a practical difference. The Egyptian book was a material artifact. Some beautifully illustrated scrolls could be well over 15 to 20 meters long, containing famous spells like spell 125 with the weighing of the heart vignette, whereas the Tibetan book is part of a ritual performance tradition existing in written form, but coming alive through chanting and auditory transmission. Both traditions share the notion that death ushers the soul into a series of intermediate stages before reaching its final destination, be it rebirth or paradise. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased, composed of different aspects such as the Ka and Ba, must navigate through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. This journey is often depicted as passing through a sequence of gates or caverns, each guarded by supernatural beings. The deceased needed to know the names of these gatekeepers and recite specific spells to get past them. The Book of the Dead provided those passwords and protective charms. For instance, spells to fend off serpents or avoid traps. Ultimately, the journey culminates in the Hall of Two Truths, where the famous weighing of the heart ceremony occurs. Here, the heart of the deceased, which metaphorically contains the record of their deeds, is weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, truth and cosmic order, by the jackal-headed god Anubis. If the heart is not heavier than the feather, meaning the person's truth and goodness are intact, the deceased is judged true of voice or justified and is allowed to enter the field of reeds, Aru, the Egyptian paradise that is an idealized, lush version of life on earth. If the heart fails the test, it is devoured by the monster Amet, and the soul undergoes a permanent second death, essentially ceasing to exist. In Tibetan cosmology, the journey is not toward a single final judgment and static afterlife, but toward rebirth, in one of 6 realms, as already detailed. There is also a kind of judgment scene with Yama, but rather than a once and for all verdict of salvation or annihilation, it's determining the next cycle of existence. The Tibetan text describes multiple opportunities across 49 days to influence the outcome, whereas the Egyptian spells are more like a checklist to ensure safe passage through obstacles and into a singular, eternal destination. Perhaps the starkest difference lies in the ultimate spiritual goal as taught by each text. The Egyptian Book of the Dead's goal is immortality in the physical spiritual paradise of the field of reeds. For the Egyptians, the afterlife was essentially a continuation of this life under ideal conditions. One would have farms, enjoy feasts, reunite with loved ones, and be in the presence of the gods like Osiris. Death was a hurdle to get past in order to live forever unchanged in a perfected version of Egypt. To that end, enormous cultural energy was devoted to preserving the body, mummification, entombing goods, and inscribing texts to ensuring one's personality and status carried over intact. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, however, treats any continued worldly existence, even a pleasurable one, as still being within samsara, and thus fundamentally unsatisfactory. Its highest aim is not immortality in a heaven, but liberation from the cycle of rebirth entirely. In other words, cessation of suffering and reincarnation rather than continuation is the goal. This reflects the divergent religious frameworks. Egyptian religion was focused on cosmic order and the eternal life of the soul, whereas Buddhism, even in its Tibetan form, ultimately sees any conditioned existence as marked by impermanence and urges escaped into unconditioned nirvana. As one commentator aptly put it, the Egyptian text aims for justified immortality in the field of reeds, while the Tibetan text seeks liberation from the cycle of rebirth entirely. This also means that failure modes differ. In the Egyptian view, failure means annihilation, a kind of permanent death. In the Tibetan view, failure means simply taking another birth, which might be good or bad, but always temporary and leading to death again. Both texts are rich in imagery of deities, monsters, and spiritual beings, but their nature is understood differently. The Egyptian figures, gods like Anubis, Osiris, Thoth, or Thoth, and various demons, were conceived as external, objective beings who inhabit the cosmos and with whom the soul must negotiate. The deceased in Egypt is essentially at the mercy of these divine judges and protectors. The spells are meant to butter them up or compel them to assist. For instance, spell 308 of the Book of the Dead is a formula addressed to one's heart not to betray its owner during the weighing, a plea for divine assistance or a magical coercion of sorts. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the deities, peaceful Buddhas, and wrathful Herokas, are ultimately manifestations of the mind of the deceased. They have no independent existence outside one's perceptions in the bardo. This is a distinctly Buddhist and particularly Vajrayana perspective. The microcosm of the mind projects the macrocosm of experiences. When a Tibetan bardo traveler sees Yama or a wrathful deity, it is their own karma and mental contents taking shape. This not only empowers the deceased, since by changing one's mental response, one can alter the experience, but also ties into the Buddhist notion of non-theism, samsara. There is no creator god or final judge in Buddhism. Even Yama is himself a being stuck in samsara, depicting often as having an illusory existence. Egyptian religion, on the other hand, is polytheistic and uses a mythological narrative. Osiris's resurrection, Horus versus Set, etc., as the backbone for afterlife expectations. Tibetan texts use psychological and moral narrative, mind's delusions versus mind's enlightenment. Both traditions strongly emphasize that one's conduct in life influences the afterlife outcome, and thus both encourage ethical living and ritual observance as preparation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead contains the famous negative confession, where the deceased declares before 49 judges that they have not committed various sins. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not lied, etc. This highlights that only one who has lived according to Ma'at, truth, justice, harmony, can hope to pass the weighing of the heart. Tomb inscriptions often admonish the living to be righteous so that they too can be vindicated in the hereafter. Similarly, the Tibetan teachings remind constantly that what one experiences in the bardo is a direct result of one's karma and habits. The six realms doctrine is essentially a way of saying every action has a consequence. Anger leads one toward hellish experiences, greed toward ghostly misery, ignorance to animal dullness, etc. Therefore, both traditions teach preparation during life is crucial. The Egyptians prepared by studying spells, commissioning a proper scroll, and living in accordance with Ma'at to have a light heart. Tibetans prepare by spiritual practice, meditation, ethical conduct, and familiarization with bardo teachings. Indeed, Tibetan lamas often engage in death meditations, rehearsing dissolution and visualization of the clear light, specifically to ready themselves for the actual death moment. They also encourage devotees to rehearse letting go in small ways, like in dream yoga, recognizing dreams as bardos, etc., so that the final letting go at death will be smoother. Both cultures also had elaborate funerary rites carried out by specialists. Egyptian priests performs mummifications and recitations from the Pert M. Heru, Book of the Dead, during the funeral, while Tibetan lamas conduct the readings and other death rites. In both cases, it was considered essential to have these rituals to ensure the dead person's well-being. A neglected death, no proper burial, or no lamas called, is seen as tragic. The soul might wander or come to harm. Despite the differences, the overarching similarities are intriguing. Both Books of the Dead reflect a view that death is not an end, it is a transition, and that the journey through death can be perilous without guidance. They each assure us that with proper knowledge, gnosis, be it knowing spells or recognizing mind's nature and preparation, the soul can conquer death's challenges. Both texts use the metaphor of a journey with many stages. Egyptian souls travel from gate to gate, Tibetan souls from bardo to bardo. Both depict judgment scenes and emphasize that one's deeds affect the outcome. They also share some structural resonance. For example, the notion of trial by elements. In Tibet, the elements dissolve at death. In Egypt, there were spells addressing elemental powers. One spell is to not die a second time by fire or drowned in a flood in the underworld. Both have a strong moral underpinning. No amount of magical knowledge can save someone who is utterly wicked in Egypt. Their heart would be too heavy. In Tibet, they'd be inevitably drawn to hell, despite lamas reading the text. And notably, both have captured the imagination of later generations as archetypal manuals of the afterlife, which is why Evans Van Wentz drew the parallel in the first place. To illustrate, consider a scenario. In ancient Thebes, a scribe named Ani dies and is entombed with a papyrus scroll showing him confidently reciting, "My heart, do not stand against me as a witness." As Anubis weighs his heart, and Thoth readies to record the verdict. The artwork on his scroll, the papyrus of Ani, circa 1250 BC, shows Ani's heart balancing against Ma'at's feather, and beyond stands Osiris ready to welcome him if justified. Fast forward to 14th century Tibet, where a lama sits by a dying patron's bedside, whispering, "O nobly born, now you confront your own Yama. Fear not the Lord of Death. He is but your mind's shadow. The mirror he holds reflects your deeds. Do not panic." Then after death, the lama will daily call out, "O nobly born, bright lights will dawn. Do not shy away." These parallel scenes show two distinct yet analogous human responses to death's mystery. One external and codified in mythic terms, the other internal and cast in yogic psychological terms. In conclusion, while the Egyptian and Tibetan Books of the Dead share the common purpose of guiding souls through post-mortem transitions, they emerge from very different spiritual paradigms. The Egyptian text is religio-magical, aiming to secure a place in the divine order through correct words and purity of heart, promising a continuation of personal identity in a blessed realm. The Tibetan text is mystical, psychological, aiming to dissolve the ego into a realization of ultimate truth, or at least to consciously steer the rebirth process, with the highest aim being transcendence of all realms. Both, however, reflect a deep understanding that how we meet death can be transformed by knowledge. Knowledge is power in the Egyptian sense, names and spells, and knowledge is insight in the Tibetan sense, recognition of mind's nature. The enduring fascination with both texts in modern times perhaps speaks to a universal longing to find meaning in mortality and to approach the great unknown with a map in hand and hope in heart. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, since its first translation in 1927, has had a surprisingly broad impact outside its original cultural context. In the West, it captured the attention not only of Buddhists and scholars, but also of occultists, depth psychologists, psychedelic explorers, and New Age spiritual seekers. Its vivid portrayals of inner experiences and its emphasis on the mind's role in creating reality resonated with various Western intellectual and spiritual currents throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Theosophy and occultism. The initial Western reception of the Bardo Thirdal was colored by the lens of theosophy, an esoteric movement that sought common mystical truths in global religions. W. Y. Evans Wentz, the pioneer translator editor, was deeply influenced by theosophical ideas. He interpreted the Tibetan text in terms of concepts like the astral plane, subtle bodies, and reincarnation as understood in theosophy, which drew from Hindu, Vedanta, and occult literature. For example, Wentz introduced terminology such as astral body, Devachan, which is a theosophical term for a heaven-like state, and references to the dweller on the threshold, which is an occult concept, when explaining the wrathful deities. He even explicitly likened the wrathful figures of the Tibetan bardo to the dweller on the threshold idea from Western occult fiction, interpreting them as obstacles the soul must face within itself. The Theosophical Society and its members embraced the Tibetan Book of the Dead as evidence of the esoteric wisdom of the East that paralleled their own teachings on afterlife realms and masters. The influence went both ways. Evan Wentz's theosophical bias meant that early Western readers often thought of the Tibetan teachings as a mere variant of the Western occult tradition, rather than a unique Buddhist system. Nonetheless, this helped the text gain popularity among those interested in spiritualism, mediumship, and occult practices. By the mid-20th century, references to the Tibetan Book of the Dead appeared in various occult and metaphysical books, sometimes in rather imaginative ways. For example, some occultists thought the bardo visions were analogous to scrying visions of the tarot's imagery of death and rebirth. The concept of using a text to guide spirits of the dead also influenced certain spiritualist practices. For instance, in the West, guidebooks were written for conducting the soul after death, inspired loosely by the idea of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. One modern example is the American Book of the Dead by E.J. Gold, an esotericist, which explicitly uses the bardo narrative as a training for conscious dying. Then there's Carl Jung and analytical psychology. A major figure who engaged with the bardo Thirdal was Carl G. Jung, the Swiss depth psychologist. Jung wrote a psychological commentary that was included in an English edition of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is the Evans Wentz third edition in 1935. Jung was intrigued by the archetypal content of the text. He interpreted the peaceful and wrathful deities, the light visions, and the general bardo journey as representations of unconscious archetypes and psychological processes common to all humanity. In Jung's view, the Tibetan Book of the Dead was not simply about what happens after physical death, but could be read as a map of the psychological death rebirth experience that an individual undergoes in the process of inner transformation. For instance, Jung saw parallels between the bardo of Dharmata, with its blinding clear light, and the experience of the collective unconscious, a sort of raw encounter with the self in Jungian terms. The wrathful deities he constructed as shadow aspects of the psyche that needed to be confronted for individuation to occur. In one of his remarks, Jung suggested that the Tibetan Book of the Dead could be read as if it were describing the process a person undergoes in psycho-spiritual crises or in active imagination, letting the unconscious contents manifest as figures, encountering them, integrating them. However, Jung also cautioned Western readers not to literalize these Eastern concepts or wholesale adopt Eastern spiritual practices without proper psychological understanding. He made it clear that his commentary was an attempt to make the material accessible to Westerners by drawing analogies to Western psychology rather than a theological endorsement of the text's metaphysics. Jung's engagement lent the bardo Thirdal a great deal of intellectual prestige in the mid-20th century, making it more acceptable in academic and psychotherapy circles to discuss such mystical content. It arguably opened the door for the later transpersonal psychology movement, which explicitly wove together spiritual concepts and psychology. Perhaps one of the most unexpected yet significant Western engagements with the Tibetan Book of the Dead was through the 1960s counterculture and psychedelic movement. In 1964, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, published The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This work was explicitly modeled on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, using it as a template to guide LSD users through the various stages of an acid trip. Leary, who had a background in psychology, felt the intense experience of ego dissolution and vivid hallucinations during a psychedelic trip paralleled the descriptions of the Bardo state. The manual reinterprets the Bardo teachings in a modern context. In Chikai Bardo, with clear light, was likened to the onset of the psychedelic experience where one might experience unity and ego loss. The Chönyad Bardo, which is visions, corresponded to the hallucinations and insights or terrors during the peak of the trip. The Sidpa Bardo was equated to the come down and reentry into conscious or consensus reality, or a new self rebirth after the trip ends. Leary's manual even suggests that one person, a sitter, should read instructions from the book to the person tripping, much as a lama would read the Tibetan Book of the Dead to a dying person. Aldous Huxley, an early psychedelic pioneer, had reportedly introduced Leary's group to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, seeing it as a profound analogy for the mind-altering potential of psychedelics. The result was that throughout the 60s and 70s, the Tibetan Book of the Dead became almost counterculture canon. Many youth who would never pick up a religious text otherwise found themselves reading about bardos and clear light because it was hip and relevant to LSD experiences. This is a remarkable form of influence. The text was repurposed into a psychological guide for altered states, thus reaching rock musicians, artists, and others. For example, the Beatles' associate and artist John Lennon is said to have been influenced by Leary's manual in the songwriting of Tomorrow Never Knows. The legacy of this in contemporary spiritual movements is evident. The fusion of Eastern mysticism with personal experimentation, the idea of ego death as a goal, a term popularized via these psychedelic interpretations, and the normalization of guided sessions. All these can trace some inspiration to the creative adaptation of the Bardo Thirdal by figures like Leary. Beyond formal psychology or the wild 60s, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has subtly permeated what we call the New Age and contemporary spiritual scene. In the late 20th century, interest in topics like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and past life regression soared. The Tibetan Book of the Dead provided a kind of exotic framework to understand these phenomena. Many noticed parallels between NDE reports, the tunnel and the light, meeting beings of light, life review, reluctance or choice to return, and the bardos, the movement toward the clear light, meeting peaceful beings, judgment scenes, etc. Researchers like Raymond Moody, who is the author of Life After Life, or Kenneth Ring occasionally referenced Eastern texts to contextualize NDEs, and the Bardo Thirdal, as a detailed afterlife manual, was naturally of interest. This contributed to a cross-cultural validation vibe. People would say NDEs prove what the Tibetan sages taught and vice versa. In New Age workshops, one might find guided meditations directly inspired by the Book of the Dead. For example, meditation on the clear light or visualization of releasing attachments as in the Bardo teachings, aimed not at actual dying people, but at individuals seeking personal growth by confronting their fear of death. The concept of conscious dying or death as a transition, championed by hospice movements and spiritual teachers in the West, draws heavily from the Tibetan Buddhism, in particular texts like the Bardo Thirdal. Sogyal Rinpoche's 1992 book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which became a worldwide bestseller, is essentially a modern commentary and adaptation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead's principles for a general audience. It offers practical advice on caring for the dying, on using meditation to prepare for death, and on understanding the Bardo states in daily life. That book alone introduced millions of readers to ideas straight out of the Bardo Thodol, such as the 49-day period after death, the importance of saying prayers and mantras for the departed, and the notion of how we live and how we die are intimately connected. It inspired hospice workers, therapists, and clergy from various faiths to incorporate more spiritual end-of-life practices. We now see meditation practices on impermanence and death, like Maranasati from Buddhism, becoming a part of mainstream wellness and spirituality communities, often with references to the Tibetan tradition. The evocative imagery and themes of the Tibetan Book of the Dead have also filtered into Western art, literature, and media. For example, the novelist James Hilton in Lost Horizon, which introduced Shangri-La, alludes to Tibetan teachings. More directly, filmmaker Bruce Joel Rubin, who wrote Jacob's Ladder and Ghost, studied the Bardo Thodol and incorporated ideas of souls and intermediary states dealing with their attachments. The 1990 film Jacob's Ladder, in particular, has a plot that closely mirrors a Bardo. The protagonist is actually dead and experiencing hallucinations that are part heaven, part hell, until he lets go and moves on. In visual art, Thangka reproductions of the Bardo beings became popular among the psychedelic and New Age scene as posters. In music, as a trivial but interesting note, the influential 1960s psychedelic folk band, the Incredible String Band, wrote a song, Invocation, which directly references Bardo imagery. And more recently, some heavy metal and experimental bands have albums thematically based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. While these are niche, they indicate the broad cultural penetration of the text's mystique. In current Western esoteric groups, neo-shamanic circles, certain yoga lineages, etc., one finds a syncretic approach where teachings from various traditions are combined. The Tibetan Book of the Dead has become one of those source texts that teachers draw from for workshops on spiritual journeying, lucid dreaming, consciousness exploration, and even between lives regression therapy. It's not uncommon for a Reiki or energy healer in California, for instance, to talk about helping souls in the 49 days after death crossover, referencing the Tibetan belief, even if they are not Buddhist per se. The language of Bardos has entered the vernacular to describe in-between phases of life. It's not unusual to hear somebody say during a personal crisis, I feel like I'm in Bardo between one chapter of life and the next. The metaphorical usage was popularized in part by psychotherapist Joan Halifax's book, Being with Dying, and other Buddhist-inspired writers, but ultimately it harks back to the symbolic power of the term as presented in the Bardo Thodol. In sum, the Tibetan Book of the Dead's journey into Western consciousness is a story of translation and transformation. It went from a monastic Tibetan ritual text to a spiritual bestseller and a source of inspiration across diverse fields. Its influence on Western esotericism is evident in the way it was embraced by theosophists and occultists looking for ancient wisdom about astral realms and reincarnation. Its impact on psychology is seen in Jungian analysis of archetypes and in how we now speak of ego death as something psychologically positive, as well as in therapeutic contexts of facing death and using imagination to work through inner demons. Very much a Bardo-esque exercise. In contemporary spirituality, the Book of the Dead helped catalyze a more open discussion of death and dying, the growth of hospice spirituality, the popularity of reincarnation concepts, and the blending of meditation with death awareness practices. It is quite remarkable that a text intended for guiding deceased Tibetans in the 14th century ended up guiding living Westerners through everything from acid trips to grief counseling sessions. The cross-cultural fertilization demonstrates the universality of the book's core message, that by understanding and befriending the process of death, one can transform how one lives. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, with its eerie and beautiful instructions, thus continues to bridge worlds between life and death, East and West, the ancient and the modern, the mystical and the psychological. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, stands as a singular testament to humanity's quest to understand and navigate the great mystery of death. Historically, it emerged from a specific context. 8th century tantric teachings attributed Masambhava and their 14th century discovery by Karma Lingpa. Yet its influence has far transcended its origins. We have seen that this text is deeply rooted in Tibetan Buddhism's philosophical and spiritual framework. It assumes the continuity of consciousness through death and rebirth, the decisive role of karma, and the potential for sudden liberation through the recognition of mind's true nature. The Bardos Thodal's intricate mapping of the post-mortem journey from the initial encounter with a clear light through peaceful and wrathful visionary Bardos to the eventual rebirth reveals a sophisticated understanding of psycho-spiritual processes couched in rich symbolic imagery. In Tibetan culture, this text is not merely literature, but a living ritual tool, integral to funerary practice and the communal approach to mortality. Its recitation has given solace and guidance to countless dying individuals and their families, embedding the ideals of compassion and awareness at the very threshold of life and death. Comparatively, placing the Tibetan Book of the Dead alongside the Egyptian Book of the Dead highlights both universal themes and distinctive contrasts. Both works serve as afterlife guides, reflecting a common human concern for what lies beyond and how we might influence that journey. Yet the Tibetan text seeks the cessation of the cycle of rebirth, nirvanic liberation, whereas the Egyptian seeks an eternal continuation in a blessed realm. The Tibetan cosmology internalizes the journey, deities as mind's projections, whereas the Egyptian externalizes it, gods as gatekeepers and judges. These differences underscore how cultural and religious paradigms shape the imagery of death. One tradition's heaven is another's samsara. And yet, the enduring appeal of both shows a shared hope that death's chaos can be made navigable through knowledge, whether that knowledge be ritual passwords or meditative insight. The influence of the Tibetan Book of the Dead on the modern world has been wide-ranging. It played a role in the Western esoteric revival, speaking to theosophists and occultists with its portrayal of hidden realms and subtle bodies. Psychologically, it provided Jung and others with a rich source of archetypes and prompted new ways of discussing unconscious processes and transformative experiences in terms of death and rebirth. In contemporary spirituality and popular culture, its concepts have inspired practices of conscious dying, influenced psychedelic experience frameworks, and contributed to a more profound engagement with death as a part of life's journey. The language of Bardo has entered our lexicon to describe any liminal transitional state, a testament to how this ancient text continues to provide a metaphorical template for transition and change. In a broader sense, the Tibetan Book of the Dead invites readers, be they devout Buddhists or merely curious minds, to confront the reality of mortality unflinchingly. It teaches that by doing so, one discovers not despair but liberation. The Dalai Lama, in commenting on these teachings, noted that remembering death can spur one to lead a more virtuous, meaningful life. This wisdom is echoed in the pages of the Bardo Thodal, which constantly urges the reader not to cling, not to fear, but to recognize the innate clarity of their own mind, even amid the greatest uncertainty. In our secular age, we may interpret death broadly, the end of anything familiar, and still find in the Tibetan Book of the Dead a source of guidance for embracing impermanence and navigating transitions with grace and awareness. Ultimately, the Tibetan Book of the Dead bridges the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. It is a book that is paradoxically meant for the living, to teach us how to die, and in so doing, how to live. Whether read as a manual for the afterlife, a psychological allegory, or a spiritual classic, it remains an object of enduring scholarly interest and a profound influence on the world's imagination about the final journey that we all must take. In appearing simultaneously to academic, general, and occult audiences, the Bardo Thodal stands as a reminder that the mysteries of death have always challenged and inspired the human intellect and spirit. As we continue to seek answers to the questions of mortality, The Tibetan Book of the Dead will no doubt remain a treasured map, guiding readers through the dark, illuminating the in-between, and pointing toward the possibility of enlightenment through hearing, even in the very midst of death. All right. Woo! That's it, and that's all. Did I have that Hey Sean thing up the entire time? Awesome. That's just fine. At least I know where I am. Oh my God, there's so many comments. So many comments. All right. Hey, Scott. Good to see you. Okay. So Tim Beck saying, I'm partial to the sand mandalas. Watching monks create, destroy them. 32 years ago. Victoria, BC. Neat. Okay. All right. So Fast Mama Gemma said Jesse Michaels had the chess player abductee. He believes in reincarnation. So Soulate US Expat saying on the Psychoactivo podcast, Pavel plays a clip of rock star Billy Corrigan from Smashing Pumpkins talk about how he saw someone shapeshift, a woman that was naked, and he didn't want to speak more about it. Yeah, I've heard about that. Okay. Do they make the orphan boys of the monastery sort and separate the sand again after they mix it all up? Who knows? The Soulate US Expat continues. Billy Corrigan said it on the Howard Stern show back in 2018, as I recall, and Howard was pushing, saying that she was Billy's lover, and he didn't want to say anything else about it. Okay, so Philip Blair said W.Y. Evans Wentz also wrote The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, 1911. This is one of the earliest books documenting UFO accounts that I know of. Interesting. Charles Fort's The Book of the Damned, next after 1990, next after Evans Wentz. Philip Blair is writing. Okay, so Fast Mama Gemma saying they got to be among us. Only AI can spot them. Okay. Tim Beck says the intricacies are truly beautiful as you spend time watching geometry construct, unfold. Anyway, it was awesome. Gotta experience it or play video games, yada yada. Soulate US Expat continues. Billy Corrigan saw this person shapeshift twice. I wish Sean got Billy Corrigan on his show sometime. That would be interesting. Yeah, there's no way he'll. I hear he's kind of notoriously pretty shy. No, AI isn't the only one that can spot them. So, Mark Fry, did you listen to the UFO chrono? Yeah, I thought. Yeah, I listened. I listened to like, I think half of it, something like that. I had it playing in the background. I thought it was interesting. But again, I didn't finish. I haven't had time to finish it, but I definitely got through about half of it. So liberation through understanding in the between is how Robert Thurman translates the title. Is what Philip Blair is saying. Bardo equals the between. Okay. Okay. So Duca to the left of me, Duca to the right. Here I am stuck in this samsara with you, Pavlos writes. Philip Blair says Maharaja, great king, incidentally. And then he's just adding a space after Maha for clarity. Maha is from Sanskrit. Sally Forth Alone is saying, anyone here listen to the band Adola, as in like an Eidolon? I never heard of them, but I'm sure other folks probably have. Okay, so Mark Fry said, have you ever seen the Three Stooges episode where Larry keeps saying Maha and his Indian robe? I have not. All right. So Pavlo says, for what it's worth, Farsight did an RV of Buddha worth a watch. Uh, did the power just go out? No, that was the piece of shit key light that I have. Unreal. Let's just shut it off. Let's just shut it off. No reason. Unreal. All right. Well, good morning, Sirius. Puff slowly, lightly. Well, I'm not going to say anything like that. Okay. Okay. So Philip Blair saying people have experienced clear light within lucid dreams. Okay. So Buddha said when he left his wife and child, he was in the middle of the night without waking, said goodbye, ball and chain, to go live in a cave served by young women feeding and watering him. And oh boy, there's still paintings of the young women on the cave walls in Mustang. Hey, Cindy Mitch. Thank you, Zen Dragon. This is interesting stuff. Okay. Woo Riders DG is saying, hello, Sean. Hope you and the family had a great, fun Christmas. God bless us all, too. Courtney Brown does Farsight. He thinks this is William Alexander says. Okay, so that biographical story is younger than the oldest wisdom teachings of Buddha. William, think of how the wisdom teachings of Jesus are older than the biographies in the four approved gospels. Okay, so Philip Blair says Jason Giorgiani refers to texts talking about the Buddha coming from a nomadic horse people. If so, the story of the Buddha leaving a home of his wife and children are a later addition. Sorry, folks, I'm just trying to get through this stuff rapidly. Finally, it's let me chat. Missing time 420. Did Google did YouTube unsubscribe you so to prevent you from chatting? Hey, Foxy Joe, good to see you. I'll let 64 saying I'm going to come back and haunt materialists. So Tim Beck says Scythian anthropology history is a deep dive, but probably survived the Jive channel for European origins. Oh, so missing time 420 is saying been sub for a while, not sure why it was being lame. That is kind of lame. Hun Her 2. Look up. Okay. Sorry, I can't read everything. I'm just trying to race through the Tuvan Throat Singers. All right, so Scott Ian says you will witness many couples doing it. Judge them by their technique and enthusiasm. Choose wisely your new existence. Oh, it might be simmering, but that's just because it's probably like, yeah, it's the, oh, the camera's moving too when I move around. So it's just because it's a green screen behind me. So it's probably, oof. Leaving the body is indicated by a spot of blood on the top of the head. Yikes. Philip Blair saying, look up Paul Ekman talking with Jim Doty for conversations on compassion at Stanford. Paul Ekman came out of retirement to do a project with the Dalai Lama on global compassion. So William Alexander said, I accidentally left my body for the first time I tried self hypnotism at 16 years old. So Dr. Paul Ekman and Dr. James R. Doty both passed this year, unfortunately. Uh, so Philip Blair said Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the infamous Stanford prison experiment, was in the audience and asked a question during the Q&A. Yeah. My wife took a class with him at Stanford, and she was in like the Psychology Honor Society. So she like they had all the Psychi honor students go to his apartment or something like that. So small world. Oh my God, so many comments. Well, thank you for the comments. I appreciate that. Hit like and subscribe too. Well, in fact, let's throw that down there. Now I got to find out where the hell I am. Oh, here we go. Okay. So Solite US Expert, I'd like to see you have Jay Anderson on again on Psyched Active YouTube channel. Pavel shows clips of Jay talking about his friend who contacted Brad Sorensen, who told Mark McCandlish about the air show. Yeah, now that he's been on Rogan, though, it might be like impossible to get him back on. So Brad Sorensen threatened Jay's friend's family. Brad, who is an aeronautical engineer, told his friend that he could design a craft that could go, yeah, I saw that, 210 times the speed of light. Yeah, it's on there. I definitely interviewed him. I mean, it was a friendly interview. Huh. Hey, Oracle Ralphie, good to see you. Oh, so Oracle Ralphie says on Christmas we brought flowers to my mother's grave site last night. I saw her in her dream. She was fine. That's sweet, Oracle Ralphie. That's a good story to hear. Hey, Vet Girl, good to see you. I know. There's a lot. There's probably most people aren't working. I work every day. There's not a day I do not work, but I have to if I want to build. you know, something that's independent of like a traditional 9 to 5. Oh boy, only 28 likes, but that who knows how long ago that comment was. Thank you, Solite Expat. I appreciate that. We, you know, if I ever breach 100,000 subscribers, I will definitely start doing things like that, where we like organize trips and stuff like that to different, sacred sites, paranormal locations, yada yada. But I'm not there yet. In fact, I'm moving in the opposite direction since I lost a subscriber net yesterday. Because you like gain subscribers, you lose them, but like I lost more subscribers than I gained yesterday. Thanks, YouTube. It's a super demotivating guy, but I'll stop. I'll get out of that negative cycle. Hey, July, good to see you. Unbelievable. So, spiritual ascension says Sean, it literally won't let some people type in chat and live chat sometimes. Weird. Oh boy. Book suggesting the synagogue of Satan. What's that? I mean, aside from the obvious, is that exactly what I think it is, or is it something different? You gotta let me know. Whew. Oh my god. These comments are just so many. Apologies if I'm not reading everyone. I have like a lot of work left. Wow. So Skyhorse Price is saying YouTube wiped me out and I've been subscribed for years. Obviously I resub. Thank you. Thank you, Skyhorse. Yeah, that's number 7. I have like 7 documented cases so far. Shazam. Oh my god. So Jalal, the 2 trees that fell. Right now I have dodged a very big lawsuit. My tree fell on my neighbor's house. Yikes. That's horrible. Well, that's good. There's no damage. It's a solid block. Hey, happy birthday. Happy birthday, Solite US Expat. It's coming up, I guess Wednesday, but happy pre-birthday. Yep, that's right. Because if someone who like wants to bring a bunch of haterade, oh, so Oracle of Ralph is saying this chat is our privileges. That's right. Because somebody wants to come on and like spew haterade, like they can, but they need to be subscribed. Otherwise, it's just people will just come in and just yeah. Wow. 2 minutes to spare. So Tim, Night, Sean, Bud, last comment. Cheers. Happy New Year. Happy New Year, everyone. It's not the last comment, I guarantee it, because I still have 2 minutes, and I religiously will like follow the timing. So it could be the last comment, but I don't think so. I think there'll be more, given we still have 2 minutes. So I hope you all have a very had a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, all that good stuff, and that you have a Happy New Year. And obviously, I will see you all next week, but definitely Happy New Year. Oh, yeah. Everybody say a prayer for Solite US Expat so he gets the job. Happy New Year, Jalay Jalal. And thank you everyone for, continuing to boost my spirits and keep this channel going because man, it has been a slog. Uh yeah, of course Korean won. No, I just assumed instant like immediately. Yeah, I think I've been to Korea is like the only Asian country I've ever been to. South Korea, obviously. So, but anyway, going back to just have a happy new year, make sure you spend time with your families. And I'm just like desperately just trying to get work done ahead before I have to return to work. So, good night, everybody. One more minute and then, oops. Yeah, thank you, Oracle. Appreciate that. Yeah, 2026 is going to be interesting. So, anyway, good night, y'all. God bless. Happy New Year. And I hope you enjoy this weekend and next week before kind of going back to work. So God bless. Good night. Oops, I almost pressed the wrong button. Good night, everybody.